Hello, and welcome to this session on maintaining a culture of rigor while building relationships through inquiry. Quite a mouthful. This session is brought to you by Grand Canyon University and Canyon Professional Development. Hello, my name is Marnie Landry, and I'm the project director for K-12 outreach at Grand Canyon University. Before coming to Grand Canyon University, I was a high school science and STEM integration teacher. During this session, I will be referring to several documents and resources. You will have access to all of those documents and resources on my link sheet. So now would be a good time to pause and copy down this bit.ly. When you go to the bit.ly, it will open up a document that looks like this. You'll know you're at the right one because the title, Maintaining a Culture of Rigor While Building Relationships Through Inquiry Learning, is here at the top. Here's the bit.ly, and these are links to all of the documents. So when I refer to them, you will go back over to your link sheet and open it up. My quote for this session is, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not of fighting the old, but on building the new." We're focusing on inquiry and relationship building. And the reason I say is to not fight the old is this may be a new way of thinking for some of you in your teaching. If you have experienced a classroom as a learner for 10 or 20 or more years in one way, and I'm going to ask you to think about a different way, just have an open mind for a little tiny bit. Going to start the session with my own essential question about how can inquiry learning support a culture of rigor and relationship building? They seem to not really go together. So my job today will be help you see how those go together. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on the work of Trevor McKenzie and the inquiry process. He has some great visuals to help you, your peer teachers, and your students think about inquiry. And I really like this poster about the inquiry process. Notice it's really a journey, really kind of a curvy journey that goes up some hills and down some valleys. And it's not just a direct, here's the content, pass the test, right? So you got to keep that in mind. It's really a journey. And today's journey into inquiry learning is really going to focus on the essential question. Notice there's a lot of other things to focus on, but we're really going to be focusing on the essential question and a little bit about exploration and research, and then just thinking about the whole entire process. So again, this is about inquiry, but it's also about relationship building. Like, how do we bring those two things together? One's really just about what we think is self-directed learning for students. How does that build relationships? Well, students will get to build relationships with one another and with you when you give them voice to their work and you give them choice. This starts to build trust with the instructor, and as the instructor can guide them through their learning, they will start to have trust with one another. So that's where the relationship building comes in. And inquiry learning is truly about asking questions and answering questions. And when students are given the opportunity to ask questions and answer those questions, they feel empowered when you give them choice. When students are heard, they feel valued. When they're heard, they start to build trust again with the instructor and with the other students. So as a teacher, I would like you just to think about something for a moment. Like, how often do you ask students what they would like to learn? How often do you give them the opportunity to learn something that they really want to learn? And if you do that, how often do you actually follow through from asking them to letting them learn what they're interested in? I'm not telling you to do that in all of your classes all the time. I just want you to think about that. And kind of stepping back a little bit more about that voice and choice, I want you to think about your students, maybe the group you just had or the one you're in the middle of having, And I want you to think about the decisions that you let your students make. So in a moment, I'd like you to pause the video. And if you have Post-its or sticky notes, one sticky note, think about decisions you let your students make. If not, just write them out on a scratch paper. So go ahead and do that now. All right, some of you may have no sticky notes. You don't let your students make any decisions. And some of you may have a whole bunch of sticky notes. When I first started teaching, I probably would have had 0 sticky notes in front of me. I did not allow for any decisions to be made by my students. I was fearful of what would happen if they started making their own decisions. I feared that I would lose control of the class. So I made every decision for them. And my students did fine. Looking back, they were just highly compliant. So slowly, as I learned my craft, I learned to give up more of that freedom to the students, let them ask more questions, let them answer more questions. So just kind of keep those to the side. We're going to come back to them at the end of this session. I want to go back to that asking and answering questions and students being empowered by choice. And we know that we have to teach the content. There's many ways to teach the content, but how valuable is teaching the content if we're missing some critical components? And some of those components are communication skills, critical thinking skills, collaboration, and finally, creativity. If we're not fostering those in the learning, we're really just memorizing. We're not learning. You may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We think about this as teachers all the time. We're always concerned about students' physiological needs. Are they getting what they need outside of the classroom? Are they fed? Are they warm? But we have to think about the whole child and all of those different circumstances. And as we start to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, teachers, we start to address some of these psychological needs and hopefully the self-fulfillment needs. So why this deep philosophical discussion here when I'm talking about inquiry learning? Well, if inquiry learning is done with fidelity, students are communicating and collaborating all the time, which you'll notice on Maslow's hierarchy here leads to a feeling of belongingness and community. So the more you can get students to communicate and collaborate, they will have this psychological need fulfilled, at least in your classroom. As we move up Maslow's hierarchy, when students are given the challenge of critical thinking, problem solving, asking questions, given the freedom to answer the questions that they're asking, they have a feeling of accomplishment. And so that raises their self-esteem and they're getting some of that psychological fulfillment. And finally, the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy is really that self-fulfillment when students get to be creative. They get to self-actualize their thoughts, their questions, their problem-solving skills, and then to share that. So it's really critical to not just think that these are useless separate skills. It's really important for me to just teach the content. No, the students have to be able to learn how to do these skills. You need to be able to foster that trust in your classroom so they can be met at all levels. So back down from the philosophical insight of why this is important to what inquiry learning really looks like. There's 4 major parts to it. Every inquiry lesson has a great essential question. There's some kind of use of sources. This could be, written lecture, video, art, any kind of resources you would use in your classroom, the textbook. It's teaching students how to build their literacy skills and actually evaluate those sources for how either accurate or valuable they are, and let them start to make some judgment calls. And then them answering that essential question using evidence. And that is not always what we think of inquiry learning. You might think, oh, I gave them a research project, they're going to inquire about it. There's some subtle differences here. Inquiry learning is not just giving out a topic, doing the research, presenting the findings, like in a paper or a poster, and then you grading them on how correct it is or how complete it is. There's more student choice built in there. So keep in mind, this is not what inquiry learning is. We're going to kind of jumble things around and give the students a little more freedom. Trevor McKenzie has this great analogy of what student inquiry looks like in this pool. What I'd like you to do is pause and look at the 4 areas here of the pool and just sketch a few notes down about what you notice about the teacher and the students in each of those scenarios, the teachers, the students, and the tools that are being used, and the teachers, the students, how they're handling themselves and others. So just think about that, jot a few things. Who are the students relying on in each of these scenarios? And notice they're all in the pool swimming. What's the difference? All right, now that you have some ideas about the 4 different areas in the pool, here's how Trevor describes these as the different types of student inquiry. The first one, the structured inquiry. Notice that the teacher is in the pool with the students and the students are all exactly following what the teacher is doing, and they're all doing it together. As we move from structured to controlled, the teacher's still in control here, but the students have a little more freedom. They will be now answering some of their own questions. They're using some tools. Notice they've all got little boards there. Guided inquiry. The teacher has stepped back and is now outside of the pool, and the students are relying on their own skills now without some of those supports to move them forward. The students might have the freedom to design their own product that you might be assessing to answer that essential question. And then finally, free inquiry. This is where students get to choose the topic, choose their resources, and choose the outcome. Notice they're still all swimming. They're all safe. They're all participating. So one really important thing I need to point out is that free inquiry does not mean free for all. You as the teacher have still set up all the supports along the way, all the scaffolding needed to get students to that point, and they're all participating. So be really careful not to think that free inquiry is just free for all. You might be a little afraid to implement inquiry because you think, oh my gosh, once I give the students choice, they're just going to go wild and I have no control. That's not the case. You're not giving up everything. You're just slow. Your students can do it. It's all dependent on you. How much control are you willing to give up? Just try a little bit at a time. Start with structured, okay? Start with structured and slowly move over. Most teachers will never get to free inquiry, and that's fine. Free inquiry is not necessary for students to learn effectively in the inquiry style. Something else I'd like you to think about with your teaching is kind of a change in your role. When I grew up, my teachers were the source of all knowledge. Or I could go to a really outdated encyclopedia and get some old knowledge, right? So switching from that source of all the knowledge to really a coaching mindset, you now need to be highly skilled in directing students on how to find information, use the information, how to communicate that information. They're no longer needing to get the actual content information directly from you. So that's one of the major internal shifts for a teacher when we're talking about inquiry learning. To demonstrate in a very brief cycle what this could look like, I'm going to go through a quick inquiry cycle with you. So I said inquiry really has 4 major parts, and the first one is an essential question. And that essential question is typically built around what we call a provocation, something to get students' interest. Again, it could be a video, it could be a quote, it could be a piece of artwork, it could be a piece of literature, it could be a newscast, anything that's dealing with the content or the topic that you want them to learn about. And then you crafting a very well written essential question. The essential question is essential to inquiry learning working, and it is really the hardest part of the whole process. If you open up your link sheet, I have a document called Essential Questions, and that is item number 1, writing essential questions. Now would be a great time to kind of pause and read over this essential questions worksheet. At the top, I've got 4 major categories of types of questions. And oftentimes when teachers are first learning to write an inquiry question, like their first essential question, they write it and they think it's fine. But if you go back and look at the types of questions, you might find that you're really writing a hook kind of question instead of an essential question. You might be writing a leading question. This is usually the most common one that I find teachers start writing. It really is leading them to the correct answer. And with inquiry learning, we're not leading them to any one correct answer. And a guiding question kind of guides them in the direction you want them to go, as opposed to kind of opening them up to making their own decisions. And at the bottom, I have examples of what those 4 look like. So if we were thinking about diet and nutrition, a hook question, something that, oh, that's really interesting to them. Can what you eat help prevent zits? Well, yeah, I would say a lot of teenagers especially might be interested in this. So it's a hook, it gets them interested. But it's pretty closed off. A leading question, what types of foods are in the food groups? We want to learn about nutrition. This has some right and wrong answers. So we're really leading them to right and wrong answers. A guiding question, what is a balanced diet? We're guiding them towards the topic, but there's definitely a set answer that we're looking for them to give back to us. Notice this wide open one here at the end, this essential question. It's kind of scary. What should we eat? You notice there's a lot of variation of what could go in there. Notice that we're not necessarily looking for a right answer here. We're looking for students to understand what that question means, to use a variety of resources to answer that question, and moreover, argue from evidence the answer to that question. And student A may have a very different answer from student B. What's also really nice about this is it can bring in the cultural aspect. What should we eat might be a very different cultural answer for different students, but they're still going to learn about nutrition and a balanced diet along the way. So this will take a little bit of time. So I would ask you to pause and work through the rest of this worksheet. There are some things that are really important to writing an essential question. And then there's some more examples. And then there's some things for you to, some more examples and some things for you to think about how you are going to evaluate your own essential question. When you're ready, come back and we will do a mini inquiry cycle. All right, here is our mini inquiry cycle. And I have chosen the essential question. Do our parks do what they are supposed to do? My provocation is just a picture of a park. This essential question is really going to frame the summative performance task. Students will answer this question as part of their summative performance, and I will be evaluating their ability to defend their answer to this question. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know what they think is the answer to this question. And that, again, is not the important part. That's not the thing that I'm grading. I will be assessing how they get to that answer and how they defend it. As you think about this, I'd like you to act as a student and just think about that question, and does it open more questions for you? If you have sticky notes, you could write one question per sticky note. If not, just write some out on a scratch paper. some questions that I might ask is, I wonder what the definition of a park is. I wonder who said they're supposed to do something. I wonder, do I even know what a park is supposed to do? Some of your students may have never been to a park. Depending on where they live now or where they grew up, their parks may look very different. So giving them some time to write some questions about this essential question is critical to get you all on the same page, for you to start to understand students' previous experiences and what they're thinking. Once you have several questions recorded, and again, in class, it's great to do it on sticky notes because I'm about to ask you to do a sorting exercise with those using a question matrix. So looking at this question matrix, I would like you to think about those questions that you wrote down and where would they go on the matrix? What, where, when, who, why, how is over on the left. And then is, did, can, would, will, might across the top. And sometimes this is really helpful to give to students before. Well, I would let them ask them their questions first. They're not always going to write the highest level questions or appropriate questions or that many questions, but let them get started and then provide them the matrix. And these actually work as stems. So I could pick a word off the left, when, and then I could go up and pick did. When did we define what a park is? Who can use our parks? Where will the city put more parks? So you can start to use this question matrix to help the students think about different ways to think about their thinking. And also it helps you probably as a teacher slowly start to guide your questioning in class down to that bottom right. Think about when you're asking students, are you mostly clustered in this upper left? These are pretty factual, straightforward. As we go further down to the bottom right, allow for more creative thinking, prediction, explanation of process. So if you wrote down questions, I'd like you to go ahead and sort your questions out, how they fit on the matrix. If you find that you're missing some questions in one of the quadrants, go ahead and try, I challenge you to write another question or two so you put something in each of the major 4 quadrants of this matrix. On your link sheet, I did give you a copy of the question matrix. It's number 2 right here. And for your own benefit, besides the first one, which is the one I just showed you, I created a second version of it. If you are really familiar with Bloom's or you use Bloom's vocabulary, you'll notice I've got Bloom's vocabulary here on the left. So identify who, describe what, explain where. So this is a really good way for students and for you to craft your question asking, like predict why somebody would have to define what our parks are supposed to do. Before I wrote this lesson, I didn't even know that parks had a purpose. All right, the second step in inquiry learning is really those literacy skills and evaluating those sources. So this is where kind of that you're starting to guide them towards answering that question. You might be prompting them with more questions. Here's some examples. What did Frederick Olmsted think parks should be for? We find out, I found out that he's considered kind of the father of public parks in the US. And how did Olmsted think his parks could improve people's lives? You could just set students loose with these questions. You could provide the resources. You could provide a choice of resources to start answering these. Challenge them. Were there other people who were asking these questions at the same time? And there's some opportunity for formative assessment in here as they're answering these questions. Now we're to the part where we're asking students to evaluate some of that information. What are the pluses and minuses of Olmsted's design? So there's not a right or wrong answer necessarily here. They may have their own opinions, and it's not about having a right answer. It's about supporting your argument with the evidence. So we're teaching them higher level literacy skills. So once you've had some time for direct instruction, some of that formative assessment to see if they're understanding the research skills, you're helping them understand how to argue from evidence, we can take them back to the question matrix that they did when they first started. Maybe they did in pairs and groups of 3. Can they actually answer some of these questions now? Some of them may have been simple lookup questions. Some of them, the higher level ones, may be predictive, some analyzing questions, but definitely let them go back and answer some of those questions. So a provocation, an essential question, letting the students ask some of their own questions, some guided learning, and then eventually coming back to the final summative assessment and answering this essential question: do our parks do what they're supposed to do? We want students to be able to answer this question using the evidence they found, using their life experience, using collaboration with their peers, and learning some of that communication, those communication skills in their presentation. Maybe you've defined how they have to present this answer. Maybe you open that choice up to them. Does this have to be a research paper? Could it be a video? Could it be an animation? Could it be a piece of art? Remember, we're not necessarily assessing how that final product looks, it's how they got to that answer. With inquiry learning, one way to think about this is what's called the 40-40-40 rule. Depending on what you're teaching, how long do you want the students to, first of all, know the content and the process of what they learned? What do you want them to think about in these different sets of time? 40 days from now, what do you want the students to remember? Do they need to remember Frederick Olmsted's name and maybe his definitions of a park? Okay, maybe. But is that really important 40 months from now? Is that important 40 years from now when they're in a position making decisions? Perhaps they're in a position making decisions for people who live in a city about what type of park should be included. They may not need to know those facts in those years, but they need to know how to investigate that question, how to interact with others in order to answer that question. So an essential question really focuses on that 40-month to 40-year time period. What is it you really want them to get out of this? Not the correct answers on a test, but what's going to be important to them in their life, in our society, in 40 years from them learning this. At the beginning of the session, I asked you to write down, either on sticky notes or on paper, what decisions you let your students make. I'd like you to look back at those sticky notes, those ideas, and I want you to think, are there more decisions you could add based on this presentation? Are there some things that you could let them decide? So go ahead and pause and see if you can come up with a few more things that you can permit your students to make decisions about. And finally, I'd like you to think, do you have an answer to how inquiry learning can support a culture of rigor and relationship building? To me, it supports relationship building through that trust. You're giving the students voice and choice. You're telling them, I trust you to speak out. I trust you to make some choices. And as a teacher, I carefully guide them along how they voice what they're learning, how they make those decisions. I have to decide how much I'm comfortable with, and I slowly give up that power to them to voice and make choices. And how is this supporting rigor? My essential questions are designed around content, standards, and what the enduring learning needs to be from those content standards. Why did somebody decide that that was an important thing for students to learn? I need to keep that in mind, and that's how I'm building in the rigor. I hope you're able to take away some new thinking, challenge some of your previous thoughts about inquiry learning. And I want you to know at Canyon Professional Development, we are here to empower, educate, and inspire you, our teachers, so you can take action to fulfill your purpose and to serve others. I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is full of videos aimed at teachers and educators. We have hundreds of tip of the day videos on how to use technology, little teaching tips for the classroom, and many 30 to 60-minute webinars where we bring in experts on either content area, community outreach experts, and experts in teaching pedagogy, and they're all there for you for free. And finally, visit canyonpd.com, where we have professional development on demand, custom PD. We also have a lot of other free resources available for you. Thank you very much for attending this session on inquiry learning and how it helps to build relationships and rigor in the classroom.